I have a question for you, as I often do as I start the program. The question is this: is your stress level where you want it to be? If you were with us last time, you heard me ask you, how is your stress level? So the question is, how has that been going as far as trying to get your stress down? Do you know why, if it is not down, do you know why that's the case? Well, we're going to look at that on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome to Journey to Healing. Do you find yourself discouraged, troubled, in need of healing, but not sure where to turn? Jon Uhler, a licensed professional counselor, is here to help. Jon has more than 25 years of professional experience helping people deal with the issues that keep them emotionally and spiritually stuck. There is help. There is hope. There is a God who loves you and wants to help you find peace and strength. And Jon Uhler is here to help you find that on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We are in a series, an extended series on the subject of boundaries. And the reason being is that when it comes to stress, inevitably, in one way or another, you can trace it back to an issue of boundaries. There are other things, of course. We live in a fallen world. We go through very difficult things. But on some level, inevitably, you can trace your stress level almost assuredly back to boundaries, as well as the issue of grief and loss. If you have been with us for any extended period of time, you will know that all of the mental health issues that people deal with, just shy of an organic issue, something to do with the brain or brain injury. So all things being equal, in the vast majority of normal counseling cases, it really comes down to two things: unresolved loss, and that process is called grief, and there are stages of grief, but we can get stuck. And then that will impact our ability to be fully present in the moment. That's a fancy way of saying I won't be fully present, meaning I won't be able to discern how much to bring to the table. I will tend to be reactive, emotionally reactive. I'll tend to be either, I'll tend to shut down or I'll tend to escalate very, very quickly. So one thing to discern as to whether or not how things are going in terms of boundaries is, do you have buttons and triggers, and can you have a voice? Can you decide how to respond, and to what extent can you act in your best interest? That's assuming you're a halfway reasonable person, but we all tend to think so. Let me invite you to go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab to bring yourself up to speed where we are, because we are picking up where we last left off. We looked at, and we are looking at, the people in our lives that shouldn't be. That shouldn't be in our lives. So if you have certain kinds of people in your life that are causing you constant stress, the question is why? There's reasons for that. But if you keep certain kinds of people in your life that are going to be draining you, that are going to be disrespecting you, then you invite problems, and it's never going to get any better. As we head into the holidays, the question is, are you looking forward to that? If you have grief and loss that is unfinished, you probably won't be looking forward to the holidays. That's understandable, but I encourage you to move through that process. If you have people in your life that you kind of have to take a deep breath before you step through the door, the question is, what's all that about, and should that be? Should you continue to do that to yourself? We've looked extensively at the kinds of people that will cause us to bring pain upon ourselves, and unnecessary pain. It's only a matter of time in life that we experience pain, and the two sources of that, again, is living in a fallen world And then you add people. But the question is, with the people that you have in your life, is it productive pain or unproductive pain? Is it self-imposed, or is it through trying to help people? And then the question is, again, what kind of person? So we've been looking at the kinds of people that you shouldn't have, the kinds of people that will begin to take a toll upon you, the kinds of people that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, and we've referenced that extensively. Remember, he's talking to a Jewish audience, so talk about shock value when he says, do not cast your pearls. We've looked at that extensively. What is a pearl? It is whatever is valuable to you, whatever it really has to do with your time, effort, energy, resources, your dignity, the things that are essentially yours by nature, the fruits of your labor as well. So if someone is not respecting you, then you are investing yourself in someone who is going to keep taking and taking and taking. And then, as Jesus said, what will happen is this: if you give your pearls to them, they're going to trample your pearls, meaning they're going to disrespect and not value what you're giving. That would be bad enough. But then they're going to add injury to insult, or insult to injury. They're going to then turn on you. And especially if you try to get out of the pig pen, if you try to turn the spigot off, now you'll find out the nature of the person you're dealing with. So we have to have discernment. We do not get any brownie points for dealing with pigs, and that is not a pejorative term. We're not calling names. That is an assessment, a term of assessment where we are trying to discern what's the nature of the person we're dealing with. So unfortunately, I don't get any spiritual brownie points if I'm dealing with someone that I shouldn't. That is not love. That is not patience. That is foolishness. That is poor stewardship, because I'll tell you what will happen. You only have so much time, effort, energy, and resources. And if you give it to someone who does not value that, what's going to happen? You will be drained. You'll give all your good stuff to people who do not care. And what are you left with? You're left with a lot of personal pain. So we have to discern. If we don't, we invite pain upon ourselves, and it is unproductive. So we've been looking at a couple of different charts. I'm going to bring that up. We left off with a chart that's pretty telling, that what happens if we invite people into our lives and we end up accepting their responsibility. You end up with a high degree of stress, and you risk being burned out. We talked about if you don't have discernment, you will end up interacting with people that are more than happy to take their load. And again, what is a load? We talked about that before. Let me bring our little load picture up here if I can find it. The load is the knapsack. There we are. So the knapsack is going to be the thing that is our responsibility to do what is right, just, and fair. If we do, and that is not to be confused with a burden. Okay, again, these are crucial, because to the extent that I confuse a load with a burden, I'm going to find myself susceptible to feeling like that. And that is my truck, and I'm the driver. Sorry, hold on. Oh gosh, I'm sorry about that. Sometimes I make myself laugh, but there's nothing funny about it, right? You're going through life, you're trying to interact with other people, and what do you end up feeling like? Where's my other picture? I'm going to get a little camper here. So we're trying to go through life. Well, here's another version of that. Okay, do you feel like that? That may be because you have, again, we talked about this before, maybe you have family baggage. So what ends up happening is, as you are going through life, we should have healthy relationships. There we are. Healthy relationships are people walking side by side, moving upward in terms of character growth, spurring one another. Actually, with this, you don't have to spur. People are moving upwards, and nobody is offloading their responsibility. They have their knapsack. And so this is a healthy relationship. We are moving towards being better people. We are encouraging one another to love and good works. What ends up happening, though, if I'm not aware of who I'm dealing with, somebody can actually take me off the path. Or I should say, I end up going off the path as they go off the path. So we're supposed to stay on the straight and narrow. We're supposed to move straight upward. But if somebody out of ego, and this comes out of Psalm 137 verses, Psalm 139 verses 23 and 24. Psalm 139. There we go. So Psalm 139 verses 23 and 24 says, Lord, search me and know my heart. Show me my anxious thoughts and my hurtful ways, and lead me in the way everlasting. So what does that have to do with anything? It has everything to do with, actually, it's counseling in a nutshell. So I'm supposed to stay on the straight and narrow, the road less traveled. Dr. Peck talked about that. So it's the road that is designed for me. It not only has to do with morals, but it has to do with ethics, but it also has to do with my own purpose in life. And if I allow someone to take me off that path, then I stunt my growth, I stop my progress, and I'm not living my own authentic life. So if someone decides to allow their ego to grow, then they're going to be pulled off the path. And you can see they kind of get off there, and I drew that on the left-hand side. And then if I stay with them, strangely enough, in a bell-shaped curve, I end up on this downward trajectory with them. And what does that look like? We looked at that last time, where I end up allowing them, let me see if I can find it here, my apologies. There we go. So they end up, see the little car in the bottom right hand? So we're driving together. I allow them to drive. And instead of going upward, where are we going? We're going down into the fog. And so we talked about last time what happens if you go, instead of moving upward, and that's a picture in China, see the terrace-like effect. So that's a pretty good example of incremental personal growth. So we are to move from one level, if you're familiar with biblical text, from one level of glory to the next, meaning one level of maturity to the next. But if I start going downward, if I allow someone who's in the minus category, I'll show that in a moment. You'll probably remember that if you have watched previous podcasts. What'll happen is I will start to go down into the valley, into the fog, and a lot of things happen in the fog, and you can see that the relationships I have start to change. And we described that as, I'll bring this up here. We described that as someone who starts to move downward as another person starts to show character qualities that are in the negative, meaning increasingly selfish. And so that person, we'll say that the little person on the right, we're going to give an example again of an unhealthy relationship. So here would be an example of it, of a predatory relationship. We looked at that in the past. That is someone that is dumping. Okay, so he's dumped a lot on that person. Is gender neutral. So the person on the right is benefiting from how things are. How can we say that? Because they're not carrying any of their responsibility, especially emotionally responsibility. So what ends up happening is then the person on the right doesn't have any responsibility. Here we're looking at a reasonable relationship where two people own their own stuff. That is the goal of counseling, by the way, is to help someone discern what is their stuff versus is not their stuff. So the goal of relationships is simply this. So this is the goal of counseling. If you're starting counseling or if you're in it, the ultimate goal is to ensure you have one knapsack, that you have relationships that look like this right in this picture. Okay, each person has one knapsack. And again, what does that look like? It looks like that healthy kind of relationship. Will there be times that people have difficulty? Of course there will. But there's a big difference between someone that means the best and intends the best and what happens when somebody starts to stumble, as it were. Then we help them. But you notice these folks haven't offloaded their responsibility. So we are our brother's keeper. We are to reach out and help someone, but we are to never allow them to take off, as it were, their responsibility and put it on us. If we do, what happens is this. We start to go into the fog. Now, let me see if I can find that same picture in the fog. But you see the baseline right there? We're going to view, as a matter of fact, here's another picture of it. I superimposed that upon a valley, so you can see the mountain right there, and then that entire valley is covered with fog. Okay, and so the warning is, do not go into the fog. Do not let someone pull you into the fog. Why? Because bad things happen in the fog. You will find that the relationship starts to change, and it actually doesn't change. What happens is the person starts to reveal themselves. So healthy people do not take someone into the fog. In the fog, the one thing that happens is this. The person who's taking you in there, taking you for a ride, is hardening their heart, so they're hardening their conscience, and they are working you to where your intuition starts to decrease. So these two people right now have a reasonable relationship, but this is just baseline. They want to move upward. They need to move upward, and you can see kind of superimposed on the left-hand side, you see the scale of 1 to 10. If you get into the fog, here's what happens. Your vision gets clouded. You can't discern as well. And then eventually you can't discern what you're seeing. Are you really seeing what you're seeing? Or is it an illusion? Is it a mirage? Now you can start to see how we're going to begin, or again, talking about manipulative people. They will portray themselves as decent, as loving, but it's an illusion. We call that a hypocrite. From a biblical perspective, read 2 Peter chapter 2, 2,000 years ago. He describes it. Psychology will now come along and call this process, as I call it, the process of becoming a psychopath. Now, a lot of people in psychology will debate with that, but that's okay. They haven't worked in prison as long as I have, or as long as I did. So there's a stair-step process downward, and there's a difference between a bloody psychopath and a white-collar psychopath. Eventually, if I go down into the fog, I will find myself having to tell myself, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. Why? Because I've picked up where the selfish person is left off. The selfish person is saying, well, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. So they have violated their conscience already. Now they're confusing me, and if I buy that, eventually I will be blinded. And so now, looking again at the trajectory of things, I end up with a very, very dangerous kind of relationship. It can be dangerous in a number of different ways, but certainly it's going to take a toll on me. And as we saw last time, it will end up placing, let me get my picture out of the way, I'll have chains. And they will start to ensure I don't move. We have looked at a number of, early on, we've looked at a number of really toxic relationships, and we looked at, we looked at Mother Gothel and what she did with Rapunzel, and she put chains on Rapunzel. So again, do not go down into the fog. You invite someone up. If you go into the fog, again, what ends up happening is you will start to lose perspective, and before you know it, you're hanging out with someone that is really low in terms of character, and you then end up feeling like that. They will use you for all you're worth, and then they will toss you. Now, the question is everybody that is in need of help, let's say as they start to go downhill, or they're in that -1, -2 category, are they a pig? Are they the kind of person that we shouldn't be around? And the answer is no. You don't necessarily know at first, but you need to have discernment, because if you don't have discernment, then you may either be less gracious with someone than you should. So I'm not advocating that anybody that's having issues, you cut them off. Absolutely not. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about those smooth movers, those smooth talkers that get their way into our lives and then begin to chip away at us. Those are the pigs, and that's who we need to discern. But again, just to be sure you know who we are versus who we are not talking about, we're going to look at, again, and if you want to go back to the warthog assessment, that's going to give you a good means of finding out who are you dealing with. Are you dealing with someone with issues, or are you dealing with an actual pig? A pig will certainly have issues, but they won't own responsibility for those issues. So let's talk about now who we're not talking about. On the other side of the break, we're going to begin to look at, again, as we did a little bit last time, we're going to look at those gradations of piggishness, the gradations of selfishness. And we're going to look at the simple kind of pig, the simple kind of narcissist, who then, if he keeps going, he'll become a sociopath. And those are a little bit easier to spot, but they can still create a lot of damage. There's a lot of people that have them in their lives. So they have the lower level of sophistication, but you shouldn't have any because they will still cause you problems. So we're going to look at that. But again, who are we not talking about, or what are we not talking about when it comes to pigs? Okay, we're first of all not talking about prodigals. It's a big difference between a prodigal and a pig, and you need to know that, and churches need to know that. There's some basic differences, but in this day and age, I'm very much aware that people may not be aware of the term prodigal or the phrase prodigal son and where that comes from. So we are going to watch a scene from a film made back in the, I want to say the 70s or 80s, called Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus is the one that introduced to his Jewish audience the story of the prodigal son.
I'd like to tell you a story. Oh. Sit down, sit down.
Sit down.
A certain man had 2 sons. And one day the younger of these sons said to his father, "Give me my share of your estate now." So his father divided his wealth between his 2 sons. And a few days later, this younger son set off for a distant land. And there he squandered all the money he had on riotous living. Now, not long after this, a great famine swept over the land, and the boy began to starve. He persuaded a farmer to hire him to feed his pigs, but he was so hungry that even the husks he was feeding the swine began to look good to him. And still, nobody gave him anything. Finally, the boy came to his senses. At home, even my father's servants have enough food and to spare. And here I am starving to death. I will go home and ask my father to hire me as one of his servants. And so, he set off. Now he was still some distance from his home when his father saw him coming. And he was so filled with compassion that he ran towards his son and embraced him and kissed him. The boy said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I am not worthy to be called your son." But his father called for the servants and said, "Bring me the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Put rings on his hands and shoes on his feet. Kill the fatted calf. We must celebrate with a feast." My son was dead and is alive again.
So that is the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal came home and he was embraced. He was received back into commonality, into relationship. So we are to welcome the prodigal back. We are not to welcome pigs into our home. So what is the difference? So you had better discern, because Jesus said, do not cast your pearls before swine. So he said, with one population of people, do not have anything to do with them. With the other, you welcome them in, you help them. So we have to discern. Many churches could not, and pastors, quite frankly, if I were to ask you, tell me some of the, in a meaningful way, tell me some of the differences between a prodigal and a predator, or a prodigal or a pig. And they would not be able to say that. So anybody walks in their doors, well, they don't know. And so you have to be able to discern. Somebody walks in your door. Somebody knocks on your door. Somebody re-enters your life. Somebody calls you. You had better be able to discern the difference between a prodigal and a pig, because the outcome is going to be very different. One, we give grace to. The other, we give truth to and boundaries. So what's the difference? So that we know who to open our homes to, who to open our arms to, versus shut the gate. Okay, so a prodigal by nature, there's a big difference. Prodigal has a conscience and values it. You notice in that story, the prodigal did what? Well, he finally came to his senses. That was through his conscience. That was also natural consequences, by the way. So nobody rescued him. So that's a big part of the important issue, that we, whether prodigal or not, or pig, we cannot rescue people. So we need discernment. But you notice, when did the prodigal come home? When he came to his senses. What caused him to come to his senses? His hunger. Why was he hungry? Well, famine. Okay, so he's feeding the pigs. Why didn't he just, because it says what? He longed to eat the pods, the stuff he was feeding the pigs. So he longed to eat that. It was looking good. So the question is this: he's out feeding the pigs. Why didn't he eat it? Meaning, if it looked good, he's beyond the point of dignity. So why didn't he eat it? I put forth to you that he still had ethics. His morals were kind of shot, but he still had ethics. There was nobody that was going to watch whether or not and what's it matter? They're throwing the stuff to the pigs. It looked good to him. He was starving. He was hungry. The question is, why didn't he eat it? I believe he still knew the difference between right and wrong and private property, and he didn't want to transgress. So there you had a young man, there you have a young person, or a person who knows the difference between right and wrong and still honors that. So a prodigal knows the difference between right and wrong and will not transgress upon another person, will not take something that is not his. So you look for someone who still has a conscience and will not cross certain boundaries. Okay? So the prodigal did not negatively impact anybody. He hurt the father's heart, but he didn't transgress upon anybody else's actual boundaries. That's crucial. And a prodigal would never take advantage of someone or use them. You notice people used him because he didn't use wisdom, right? He had all this cash on him, okay? But he never used anybody. Big difference. So the question is, in prison, do you have a lot of prodigals? Typically, no. Prison is not the pig pen. Prison is prison as natural consequences, but painful consequences, because typically most people in prison have violated the rights of someone else. And a prodigal is restrained by his own ethics, again, how you treat other people. A prodigal has a sense of guilt and shame. You notice how he talked to himself. He said, I'm just going to go and I'll see if my father will hire me back. So there's a sense of humility in that. And a prodigal, therefore, is able to return. The father can receive him. Why? Because he meets the requirements of 1 John 1:9, which says this: if we confess our sins, a sin it's an archery term. There's a bullseye, there's a target. I have to hit it. It's mine. It's my requirement. But I choose not to. I missed the mark, and therefore I have blown it. And the question is, do I own it? Do I justify or rationalize, or do I call it what it is? Do I say the exact same thing that the other person does that I've hurt? Do I say the same thing about my stuff that God says? And if I do, then God can do business with us. with me, and therefore I'm eligible to return. I'm eligible for forgiveness. And a prodigal is eligible for forgiveness, but doesn't feel worthy of it and would never expect it and would never presume. There is a qualitative degree of humility within a prodigal. They don't justify or rationalize. So they're humble, and a prodigal comes to his senses because he's not blinded by pride. He hasn't gone through the twisting process. And we discussed that in one of the previous podcasts, or a number of them. What happens when I start getting into self? So the prodigal is emptied of self. A pig is full of self, but will sound contrite. There's a big difference, world of difference. So talk is cheap. What do you look for? You look for the proof. And that's going to be behavior. And we're going to look at, again, some additional ways of discerning who is or isn't a prodigal, who is or isn't a pig, and who else is eligible for grace, and who is safe to have in your life. And we will look at that on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by Jon Uhler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with Jon Uhler about your situation or in having Jon conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.